Welcome to Season Ticket, presented by Press Room Pass. This podcast is your passport to sports history with a peek at the present. The hosts, Chris and Don, will share with you their love of sports, highlighting their favorite teams and seasons. While they focus on the past, they'll talk about some current events too, and along the way they'll probably throw in a few pop culture references. This is video podcast number 1. This episode is a replay of an interview recorded on May 29th, 2020. Be sure to subscribe to the Press Room Pass channel and the Season Ticket podcast and our Facebook page to get more information about future broadcasts. Links are in the notes below. In this episode, Chris and Don welcome Alex Painter. Alex is a sports fan, former athlete, fellow podcaster, and author. Join Chris and Don as they talk with Alex about his interest in sports and sports history, his favorite teams in various sports, his love of baseball, and his transition from player to sports diarist. Listen as Alex tells how he began writing about sports and shares some interesting stories from his latest book. This video podcast is presented by Press Room Pass. We'll talk more about that and how to connect with the podcast later, but right now, let's start the show.
Hello again, and welcome to another edition of Season Ticket presented by PressRoomPass.com. As always, I'm your host, Chris Cornett. And I'm joined by my usual cohorts, Donnie T-Bone Tincher. Don, how you doing today?
Doing great. Really looking forward to this.
And Michael W. Swigert. Michael, what's up?
Hey, it's a great day.
It sure is, isn't it? As mentioned, we have a special guest today. He is from Fort Wayne, Indiana. He played football and graduated from Earlham College in Richmond, Indiana, where he is currently the Associate Director of College Admissions. He hosts his own podcast on Notre Dame football called Onward to Victory. He is also married with 3 children, and he's an author of 2 books. The first one is entitled Folk Hero Forever, The Eclectic, Enthralling Baseball Life of Luke Easter. And his current book is Blackball in the Hoosier Heartland, Unearthing the Negro League's Baseball History of Richmond, Indiana. We are pleased to have today Alex Painter. That is quite a resume, Alex, and thank you very much for joining us. And how you doing today?
Hey, fellas, I'm doing well. I can't complain. Thank you so much. It's Friday, so I've got even less complaints than I otherwise normally would, but I appreciate the very, very kind introduction.
You're so welcome.
Hey, Alex, in the preface of your latest book, I noticed that you talked a little bit about your childhood, some of those memories, and okay, the Cleveland Indians. We've had that discussion before.
Yes, indeed.
Can you talk a little bit about your interest in sports and sports history?
Absolutely. So sports is one of those things in my house, growing up anyways, that just felt like it was always present. My dad used to tell us stories about his dad, he was a baseball player. He pitched while he was on a naval base in Bremerton, Washington. He comes back to Lima, Ohio, and falls into competitive fast-pitch softball. And he was so good, this is in Lima, Ohio, so Northwest Ohio, he became known as the Bob Feller of Lima, Ohio, because he was a legend out on the sand lots. And so sports have always been big. And if you're from Lima, as both of my parents are, you either have an affinity for Cincinnati sports or Cleveland sports. So we were the latter. And I can remember being a Cleveland Indians fan since I can remember, quite literally. Some of my earliest memories of being a Cleveland Indians fan, not to take us down a dark path almost immediately here, but one of my earliest memories was my dad telling me, some of you may remember, about the 1993 spring training boat crash that killed Steve Holland and Tim Cruz. It's sad because that is my literal first memory of the Cleveland Indians. But however, in the 90s, they ended up becoming really good. And so I was always following the Indians very, very closely, as were my brothers. So been a baseball fan, been a Cleveland Indians fan since I can honestly remember, as I said, and they were some really exciting times. You couldn't have picked a better time to be an Indians fan, and then in the 1990s, of course. As far as the history of it is concerned, I remember going to my grandparents in Lima. So my parents were born in Lima, and then they moved to Fort Wayne just before I was born in 1987. And I remember going to my grandparents' house in Lima, and they had a computer game that they were really excited to show off to us, to the grandkids. It was called Tony La Russa Baseball, and it was the second one, which featured the historical rosters. So I was so excited to play as give me Jim Thome, give me Kenny Lofton, give me Manny Ramirez, Omar Vizquel. And instead, I remember thinking, like, who is Earl Averill, Addie Joss, like Larry Doby? I don't know who any of these guys are. And then I'm like, then it became clear to me, like, oh, these guys used to play for the Indians. And so that was kind of how I started learning some of these names. And Santa Claus brought me a thick chronicle about baseball history when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And that was all she wrote. That was honestly all she wrote. I've been hooked on baseball ever since. I love baseball cards. Anything baseball, I'm in. If it's 1927 in Yankee Stadium, I'm in. If it's on a sandlot in Montpelier, Indiana, 1902, I'm in. I love baseball.
Yeah. Now, not to shift gears too much, but your podcast obviously is probably about one of your other favorite teams and passions, Notre Dame football.
Yes. So thank you for that. I love Notre Dame football. So I did grow up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and needless to say, this kind of comes with the territory. So I come from this really large Catholic family. I'm actually the second oldest of 10 children. So when you grow up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and you come from like such a huge Catholic family, and that's kind of a Catholic hotbed, you're steeped in Notre Dame lore. You're steeped in Notre Dame history. I used to be a paper boy, and I used to read the Notre Dame column every day. So much that, like, Notre Dame, even growing up, kind of annoyed me because it was like, okay, I get it. I get it, everybody. But however, I love Notre Dame. I love the history. Of course, I went to Earlham. I didn't go to Notre Dame, but the podcast itself was just kind of an outlet for me to kind of share a passion, hopefully, kind of, which I know you gentlemen can certainly understand, to share that passion with other Notre Dame fans. And so the podcast itself, Onward to Victory, started, in June of 2019. And there's a ton of Notre Dame podcasts out there. So I decided to kind of do something a little different, incorporating my love and passion for the history of the college and the really kind of the human side of it, rather than just a simple, like, let's recap last week's game against the Navy midshipmen. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But I decided to kind of do a blend of history, football, and kind of the spirit of Notre Dame, for lack of a better phrase. So my first episode I did was called A Heisman at Iwo Jima, and it was about Angelo Bertelli serving on the front lines at Iwo Jima right after he won a Heisman. I did a story or an episode about Flashmore Mike, who was an Irish Terrier who was, for 40 years before the Leprechaun, he was the official on-field mascot for the football team.
Yeah.
I did a 3-part series about Notre Dame and the Civil War. So it's a bit of a different flavor, and it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of people who seem to be really interested in this kind of thing. So I guess as long as that's the case, I'll continue doing it. But I love Notre Dame. I haven't missed a game in 10 years from my living room. Of course, I don't go up there.
Right.
Well, and let me interrupt you there, Don. I'm sure you're aware, Alex, that Richmond's own Vegas Ferguson went to Notre Dame, and I have the same memories. I wasn't a Notre Dame fan, obviously, going to Purdue, but back in the 70s, before your time, young man, they used to have Notre Dame highlights hosted by Lindsey Nelson. I think Don might remember that.
Yes.
And always watch those every Sunday morning. So I have an affinity for Notre Dame too, just not as much as Purdue.
I understand. Yeah, no, and it's cool. There's the current kicker of the Richmond Red Devils, Gage Puterball, is actually being kind of recruited by Notre Dame. So he's actually going to be on the podcast here kind of once we can get into the same room. Possibly even within 6 feet of each other. Who knows?
All right.
Alex, we'll talk about your books just a little bit more, but I want to kind of get into your writing. What is it that made you want to become a writer?
Yeah, I think it was probably just a blend of loving history and being incredibly passionate about the sports and sports in general. I started writing back in 2007. For 2007, 2008, I was the beat writer for the Fort Wayne Fusion. Now, if you would have met me then, you would have known me as the arena football nut. I was in love with arena football, big time. And so in 2007, 2008, when I was a student at Earlham, I was kind of the beat reporter for a website called Arena Fan, which is still active for the Fort Wayne Fusion. It was really fun. So from there, when I was a senior at Earlham in 2010, I started a fan site. And this is actually kind of a funny story, if you don't mind indulging me. I called it the Coliseum because it was for the Cleveland Gladiators, who were in the Arena Football League. And so I started this thing because all of a sudden at Earlham, I played football there, but that was my senior year. I didn't have to do any workouts. I had all of a sudden all this free time. So I decided to start this website up. And as the Cleveland Gladiators, who were just getting going at that time, started signing players, I guess for lack of a better phrase, I'd Facebook stalk them, send them a friend request, and I'd say, hey, can I interview you for my website? And so many of them actually obliged me, which was really neat. So anyways, the first game, home opener, the first game in franchise history comes around. And I had an issue, and that was I really wanted to go. Really, really wanted to go. But when I say I was a poor college student, I didn't mean like all the college students say I was a poor college student. I mean that I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. So I didn't have money for a ticket, but I had this website. So I dug through their website and I found, a little page where you can apply for a press credential. So I applied for a press credential. I even said, #1 fan site for the Cleveland Gladiators. And I verified this because I was the only fan site for the Cleveland Gladiators. And so then I'm like 3/4 of the way through this. I put Alex Painter, writer. And I'm 3/4 of the way through this application. And I'm like, okay, Alex, you get this ticket. Cool. You have no way to go up to Cleveland because your car hasn't moved since Christmas break because it broke down. So at that point, I put my girlfriend, who's now my wife, I kind of put her down as a photographer. And what do you know? We both got accepted, and we both got press passes to go to the home opener for the Cleveland Gladiators.
Oh, that's great.
So the second half of this story is we get there. So now I had my ticket, and I'm facing insurmountable odds with no money and no car. I had my ticket and my ride up to this game. And so we go there, and we get like a special tour. They played at Quicken Loans Arena, which is, of course, where the Cavaliers played. So I got to like walk the field beforehand. They showed me the basketball floor. They showed us, I should say, the basketball floor where LeBron played. And they showed us to the press box. I'm looking at Alicia, and she's looking at me like, what have we managed to do here? And then finally, the kicker of all kickers is I like look up in the press box, and I'm like, Alicia, they're bringing pizza in. Like, I think that's for us. Like, I don't know. Go see. And so I get in line, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's for us. So I'm grabbing pizza, and someone like bumps into me. Okay, and this is the kicker. I like kind of glance over my left shoulder, and I'm like, it's Bernie Kosar. And so who owned the Gladiators, and like, you gotta understand, when it came to Cleveland Browns growing up, this was my idol. And I grew up, and my neighbor said, you gotta like Bernie Kosar. Vinny Testaverde's so overrated. They hosed Bernie Kosar. Anyways, so all I could say was, hey, Bernie. It was just like, hey, pal, how you doing? You know how Bernie kind of talks a little bit slurry all the time. Mm-hmm. And that was it. And I took the pizza down. I was like, Alicia, you're not going to believe this. I just met Bernie Kosar. So anyways, that was that. And then in 2011, I was the Indians reporter for Bleacher Report before Bleacher Report completely blew up, when it was really a community of just passionate writers. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, in 2018, I wrote the book on Luke Easter. In 2020, Blackball. So honestly, as we can all attest, it was really just born out of passion. And I have a bit of a neurotic personality. If I do something, if it's possible to jump in with 3 feet, I kind of just do it. And that's kind of how I've tackled all of these things.
Well,
that's great.
So you just mentioned Luke Easter and the first book. Can you give us a little overview of that book?
Absolutely. Luke Easter is, and I love Luke Easter. I guess I'll just get that one out of the way. I love the man. He died a decade before I was born, but I absolutely adore him. He's one of the greatest what-ifs in baseball. It has been said that the movie The Natural, that Roy Hobbs was actually, like, as far as just the raw natural ability, was based on Luke Easter. And so, of course, Luke Easter played for my favorite team. That always helps. He played for the Cleveland Indians from 1949 to 1954. He was the 11th player to break the color barrier in baseball, which is really, really significant. But what he did was he broke the color barrier, and he lied to the Indians. I don't like to say lied, but when the Indians approached him, he didn't want to say, that he was 33 years old because, they might have thought he was too old. So he said, yeah, I'm 27. See? And so he was 27. He said he was 27. He was actually 33. So when he broke the color barrier in his entire career, he was actually 6 years older than what the back of his baseball card said, which is just unbelievable. He was enormous. He was 6'4", 240 pounds, which, my goodness, he dwarfed everyone on the field. And he hit so many home runs, and they went so far. He hit the longest home runs and the most home runs anyone had ever seen. So my goal was for Full Hero Forever was to just figure out how many home runs he hit. So between the Negro Leagues, between the minor leagues, major leagues, Venezuelan Winter League, Hawaii Fall League, Puerto Rico Winter League, all of them, I calculated that he hit nearly 650 home runs. The kicker, the absolute kicker of it is that he didn't hit the first one until he was almost 31 years old. So it's amazing. He hit the longest home run in Cleveland Municipal history, stadium history. He was the only player ever to hit a baseball over the center field fence at Offerman Stadium when he was with the Buffalo Bisons in 1957. He was the only player to do it, and he did it twice, 2 months apart, and he was 42 years old. It had to have been at least 500 feet. So in addition to that, everybody loved the guy. He was unwaveringly kind and just extremely pleasant and just had a smile that lit up the room. And everything about this guy, I just admired. The tenacity, the perseverance, the kindness. I mean, he was the whole package. And of course, as we know, playing baseball as a black man in the 1940s and the 1950s, that wasn't an easy proposition. And so I've had the great fortune to meet a lot of people who watched him play and met him. And I can't say enough about him. And truly, it was the first thing I ever sat down and really, really wrote the 175-page book. Right. But really, I mean, it was a labor of love, but it was honestly quite an honor to do.
Let me ask you, you said he obviously played in the Negro Leagues before he played for the Cleveland Indians. Was he considered today one of the better, the top Negro League players? Was he up there in the Satchel Paige category and those kind of guys, or was he middle of the road? Where would you rank him as far as his Negro League days?
I appreciate that question. So he played 3 seasons in the Negro Leagues. Okay. Which honestly, he was fortunate enough in a sense to actually have an opportunity to play in the major league. So he was discovered so late. He was almost 31 years old by the time he started playing professional baseball. He came up in 1946 with the Cincinnati Crescents, which was a team owned by Abe Saperstein, who also owned the Harlem Globetrotters. Yes. That year he hit 74 home runs. So the next big step in his career was signing with the vaunted, legendary Homestead Grays. And the only reason he actually got a chance to play with the Homestead Grays is because Homestead Gray, slugger, great Hall of Famer, probably the best home run hitter in baseball history, Josh Gibson, had died of a stroke in early 1947. So the Grays turned around and signed Luke Easter, and they needed a new basher. And so they actually handed him Gibson's old number. They're almost like, hey, don't forget, you're replacing Josh Gibson. They handed him number 20. Wow. So, yeah, he hit over 70 home runs in 46. He hit 43 in 47 with the Homestead Grays, counting all contests. And in 1948, he went to the Negro League World Series with the Grays. He hit 58 home runs that year. And in the Negro League World Series in 1948, They played the Birmingham Black Barons, which featured a 17-year-old Willie Mays.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Full circle.
Okay. Well, okay. Very good. Thank you for that. All right.
So yeah, his time in the Negro Leagues would have been short comparatively,
Yeah.
but when he was there, he was dominant.
Well, short but impactful. Exactly. You're exactly right.
Well, I'm just going to interject here. The title of the book includes the word enthralling as a description of his life, and I'm enthralled by your description of it so far. If the writing is half as infectious as your description of it, this is a book well worth reading.
Michael, I appreciate that. I get really jazzed up when I talk about Luke Easter, and this is something my kids are keenly aware of, that everybody I know is keenly aware of. I think he should be in the Pro Baseball Hall of Fame. To use not a great phrase, I'll die on that hill. But who knows how many home runs this man actually hit. Honestly, he had a prolific semi-pro career in his 20s. And honestly, something that's really telling about Luke, it's a tragic, he had a very tragic ending, but after his baseball career was over, he took a job in the TRW plant in Euclid, Ohio, the Cleveland, Ohio area. He stayed there. And he started as a night shift. He didn't want any preferential treatment. He started in the night shift just polishing the airplane parts, okay? But eventually, everybody loved this guy, loved him. And so eventually he became the union steward. And soon people just trusted him like, every other Friday, hey, give Big Luke your paycheck. He'll run it over to the Cleveland Bank and Trust, and he'll bring it back to you. That was how much people trusted this man. And so unfortunately, in March of 1979, he had his briefcase full of all of the cash paychecks. And as he was leaving the Cleveland Bank and Trust, he was held up by two men, one of which was a disgruntled former TRW employee, and he was robbed. And unfortunately, he was killed right there in a holdup. So it's honestly it's a sad, tragic ending, but if it's any solace, it was just like Luke Easter. He was so giving, and people trusted him. And I don't know, like I said, sad ending, but not to be a downer, but it was truly just something that was like kind of Luke-like.
Well, it sounded like he deserved better. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
So, Alex, obviously you've got a tremendous passion for Luke Easter and the Cleveland Indians, but I'm assuming that that's kind of where maybe this led to your new book with the Negro Leagues. Can you talk a little bit about the new book and, where that took you?
Oh, I'm happy to. So, yeah, when I was growing up, I've always had a passion and an interest in the Negro Leagues. So I mentioned that big book Santa Claus left me under the tree. It was like 600 pages. It was just a chronicle, tons of pictures, stats. It's just like, it's our dream, right? It's our dream book. And I went in, I'm like, I have to figure out about this Addie Joss and this Earl Averill and this Nap Lajoie. I had to figure out who these guys were from the LaRussa game. And then I left thinking like, Josh Gibson hit more home runs than any human being. Satchel Paige pitched 2,500 games. Cool Papa Bell used to get out of bed, turn the light switch off, and he'd be under the covers before the lights went out.
Yeah.
And so I got super enamored by these guys. And Satchel Paige used to say, Cool Papa Bell was so fast that when Satchel would pitch to him, and if Cool Papa Bell hit a ball right, and he said it would whiz by my ear, and he said by the time I turned around, the ball would be hitting Cool Papa in the butt as he was sliding into second base. That's how fast he was. Satchel didn't say the word but anyways, I always had a bit of an understanding that there was some Negro League games that were played in Richmond. I always kind of had a sense of that, and I had read some things in the local paper. But to me, it just seemed like the history, first of all, just needed to be discovered, because that's a lot of baseball history. Baseball, for the longest time, it was America's pastime. It was in the newspaper all the time. They reported Sandlot scores. They reported amateur, semi-pro, minor, major, everything. Negro Leagues, you just have to find it and kind of chronicle it and string it together, which is really all I did. I started with the new book and I went through and I just found every single game that was played with a Negro League team in Richmond, Indiana. And it ended up being over 100 games, 100 plus games comfortably. I thought that was amazing. And so after I did that, I'm looking at this just glorious spreadsheet of, all my citations, the teams, the scores, the notes. And I'm like, what would have really been cool is if I went through and I chronicled every single player I was able to confirm played in Richmond. And so I went, so then I went start all the way back at the beginning, and I looked at every single game and then I kept a list of each player who played in Richmond, when they played in Richmond, what team, and all of that. So it ended up being about 375 confirmed Negro League baseball players. And from there, honestly, I just kind of strung it all together and made it a history of Richmond, Major League Baseball, Negro League Baseball, Richmond baseball. I tried to just kind of sew it all together. And some of it is breathtaking. And I mean breathtaking, and so unexpected. Richmond was the perfect place to have all of this Negro League baseball happen because we are a stone's throw from Cincinnati, Dayton, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis. So if you're going from Indy to Cincinnati, you might as well stop and play for the Richmond crowd and maybe get a couple $100, and that would help you. Negro League teams needed places like Richmond because otherwise, a lot of them would go belly up. They needed the extra cash flow from playing exhibition games. And so that's kind of what happened a lot is we hosted a lot of games in Richmond because teams are always traveling. Negro League teams would travel 200 games a year, and they were constantly on the road. Sorry, excuse me.
No, go right ahead. I'm glad you had it there.
So ultimately, what I found in combing through just decades and decades of Palladium item, Richmond Weekly Palladium pages is that 19 members of Negro League teams who were ultimately inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame came to Richmond. 19. 17 guys who eventually made it to Major League Baseball came through Richmond with their Negro League clubs, and another 30 who made it to minor league baseball. So why do Negro League baseball as opposed to just general baseball? Well, I try to incorporate as much general baseball into it as I can, but my goodness, these were generational players. Yeah. And sometimes they were playing for 200 people, at Municipal Stadium or, whatever it might be. So talk about a cool thing for the city.
Well, you know what, Alex, actually, Richmond, even until I learned of you, didn't really know about the history of the Negro Leagues in Richmond. Richmond, of course, is known for Gannett Records. You can go back and talk about the origins of that, and that's very well known. But this wasn't, and that's why I think your book's important. And I really, learned a lot about something I didn't know anything about, and I'm born and raised in Richmond. So
I appreciate that, Chris. I do. It was a labor of love, as most of these things are, but I think it's an important story to tell. And it's interesting, the idea that, Richmond in the state of Indiana in the 1920s is completely overrun by the Ku Klux Klan. Yes. And, just using that as a backdrop. But we're hosting these Negro League games. I just thought that the collision of that was the intersection of those two ideas was really interesting. And of course, you throw in the jazz and the blues music as well. It was just a very, very interesting time. And,
absolutely, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and baseball history often mirrors social history and United States history in so many ways. For so long, they were so inexorably connected, and my goodness, yeah. Like I said, it was just astonishing, all the little things that you can uncover.
Hey, Alex, you started to mention that. What's something that maybe surprised you as you uncovered some of those things? What any specific stories that you could tell us?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. So I think we probably have some Reds fans, or at least people with some Reds affinity.
Yes.
Here. Okay, so about to say the Cleveland Reds. Whoop, excuse me, back up. The Cincinnati Reds.
Blasphemy.
No, what? That's two-way blasphemy too, man. I feel like I just blasphemed myself. So the Cincinnati Reds came to Richmond to play exhibition games in 1893, 1907, 1944, and 1946. So in 1893, it was interesting because, of course, Charlie Comiskey's on the team. In 1907, Wahoo Sam Crawford is a rookie. In 1944, 1946, they played the Cleveland Indians. So Lou Boudreau was playing shortstop for the Indians. And when the Tigers came to town, it was a miserable day. They said it got in the mid-30s and it was raining. And so they said Hal Newhouser just chilled in the concession stand and drank coffee the entire game. Had no interest even being in the dugout. I loved that story because I guess the concession stand workers were just thrilled. But I clipped a picture when the Indians came to town that there were so many people in the stands that there were kids climbing trees around Municipal Stadium just to be able to see in. And so that's actually, I clipped that and it's in the book. But some other cool things. So first of all, in 1918, Richmond had its own Negro League team. It was called the Richmond Giants. And so this is something that I'm probably most proud of in the book because it's something that, unless you were really looking for it, who knows when it would have been discovered, because it's become significant because seasoned veteran Negro League players played on this team. So in the Negro League circles, guys who were really important. So one of them is Oscar Charleston, who is a baseball Hall of Famer. So we had him play for the Richmond Giants. He was inducted back in 1976. But Bill James, who some people love Bill James, some people hate Bill James, but he knows his baseball. He's called Oscar Charleston the fourth best player in history. There's a story about Oscar Charleston, not really about him, but Willie Mays was asking Buck O'Neil, who, of course, Buck O'Neil was a Negro Leagues legend.
Yes.
Huge ambassador for the Negro Leagues. He turns to Buck one day and he's like, Buck, just how good was Oscar Charleston? And Buck, who, man, he is right up there in not to be sacrilegious, but he's right up there in the pantheon for me with like Jesus of Nazareth as far as humility and kindness. He turns and says, Willie, Oscar Charleston was you before you were you. That's how good Oscar Charleston was.
Oh, that's great.
So, yeah, and then the other guy comes up, and the first time, his name's Bill Holland. And Bill Holland was the first black pitcher to start a game at Yankee Stadium. He pitched over Labor Day 1918 with the Richmond Giants. He was an Indianapolis guy. And so he was a teenager, and he was just mowing these grown men, some of them ex-minor leaguers, down. He had a nail file in his sock. He loved doing the emery ball, and he would rub that ball down, and he did whatever he had to do to get guys out. Actually, they called him Devil because he was so competitive. And they said if you hit a home run off Bill Holland, next time you came up to the plate, he'd just step off the mound and he said, get ready to duck now, because he would throw at you. He was kind of Bob Gibson before he was Bob Gibson. But so he actually made his professional debut for this team. So all of a sudden, the Richmond Giants, I kind of just was looking for something else, and I found it. And I was
what if you don't make me interrupt you, what year were the Richmond Giants together?
1918.
Oh, wow.
1918.
Okay.
So there was Oscar Charleston. If I can make a book recommendation, Jeremy Beer just wrote a biography about Oscar Charleston that is exhaustive. And I love Oscar Charleston, but Jeremy Beer has forgotten more than I know about the man.
Okay.
And so just how big of a scoop was this for me personally, I guess, not to gas myself up here, but in this exhaustive award-winning biography about Oscar Charleston, there's not a single word about his time in Richmond playing for the Richmond Giants. So I felt like that was quite a cool scoop. Okay, so that's the big one. 1918, Richmond Giants, Bill Holland, Oscar Charleston. But aside from that, Josh Gibson hit the longest home run in Municipal Park history. If I may just paint a quick timeline. In 1936, McBride, as it is now, the then Municipal was built. And so, 1936. So in 1938, Josh Gibson comes to town with the Homestead Grays, and he is the first player in stadium history to plug one over the left field fence, which was Don knows this because Don and I were talking about this for a long time, but it hadn't happened before. And to make it more impressive, it didn't happen again for 9 years. Nobody for 9 years put one over the left field fence at McBride. Which is just astonishing. And they had moved the fences in at least 15 feet before it happened again. So Gibson had an impossibly long home run. In 1933, the Chicago American Giants came to town, and they were playing against the Richmond Lincos, which was a local semi-pro team sponsored by the Lincos Gas Company. Anyways, so the Lincos just inexplicably just blow the doors off the Chicago American Giants. But if you look at who was playing for the American Giants that day, 4 future pro baseball Hall of Famers: Bill Foster, Turkey Stearns, Mule Suttles, and I believe Cool Papa Bell. So 4 guys they beat, and they beat them handily. And the kicker to that is lining up in the outfield for the Lincos was Weeb Eubanks. So you had 5 Hall of Famers on the field. One of them was a Pro Football Hall of Famer, but he was still a youngster playing semi-pro ball to make ends meet. But in addition to that, in the 40s, you had, of course, in 1946, you had Bob Feller and Satchel Paige's All-Stars barnstormed and met in Richmond, which is just so interesting still. Jesse Owens did a running exhibition. Tony Stone, who was the first woman to play for a professional team, she appeared in Richmond with the Indianapolis Clowns. The Clowns came to town all the time, and if they would have come a month earlier during one of the seasons, Hank Aaron would have been playing in Richmond. So
Wait, did I hear you say Jesse Owens came to do one of his exhibitions here in Richmond? Because I knew that he had he'd gotten some money trouble and had to do that kind of thing, and I didn't realize he came to Richmond. Okay,
Chris, that's exactly. So Jesse Owens he was very famous, but unfortunately did have like a series of very, very poor financial investments. Yes. One of them was the West Coast Negro League. And so he would travel with these teams. You know, it was meant to be kind of a minor league to the actual Negro leagues, and it only lasted a month. But so he would travel and he would, run and do running. He'd run against a horse. To try to get people in the stands, but unfortunately it didn't work out. Jesse Owens was also a heavy smoker too, which has always been so interesting to me, how he was able to run so fast. But yes, so Jesse Owens did appear in Richmond as well.
Okay. Well, hey, as we get close to wrapping up here, one of the things that intrigued me about your book, as you just look through it, your dedication.
Yes.
You dedicated it to your family. But you also added a gentleman named Snowball. What is it about that guy that intrigued you so much?
Yes. So John Snowball Merida, he is from – okay, so as I kind of mentioned before, I logged all the games, and then I went back through and started at the top and made the player registry of all the guys I could confirm. So the very first game that I looked at was the first game that kind of is chronicled, which was the 1907 game from the Indianapolis ABCs, who was one of the best Negro League teams in the land, against the Richmond Quakers, who was a minor league team. And so I started with that box score, and the very first hitter is second baseman Merida of the ABCs. So then I looked him up in the database just to kind of get to know who he was and confirm that he played on the team that year, all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, and I saw he was from Spiceland, Indiana. And I'm like, that is really interesting. My favorite Earl and Professor Tom Ham is from Spiceland, Indiana. But Spiceland is a really small place. I mean, it is a really small place. And I was intrigued because he was born in Spiceland. Now, the game was from 1907, and he died in 1911. And I was like, my God, he was only 31 years old. And that immediately intrigued me. I'm like, he's buried in Spiceland, too. So I started doing a little bit of digging about this, and I turn up these pictures, that of his playing days with Spiceland, and it is astonishing. He was the only black player on the Spiceland team. And this is, of course, 50 years before baseball's integrated. And he integrated that. He played for semi-pro teams all over Indiana and was the only black player that was on any of these teams, which really says a lot, honestly. And so some of these pictures, one of these photographs is him and 4 white teammates all together in one shot. And it just made me think, like, how unbelievably rare that was for that time. And in 1888, just for context, Frank Grant, who's another Baseball Hall of Famer, he was playing for the Buffalo Bisons, and he was the last black player to play professionally until Jackie Robinson did in 1947. He started smelling a rat that year when he showed up for the team photo, and everybody refused to be in the picture with him in it. So I thought that was really significant that, 12 years later, that John Merida is playing for, the Spiceland Academy. And he's posing in pictures, at the Spiceland Field Day. He's the only person of color in any of these pictures. And I just thought that was unbelievable. But he was such a talent. So many times over his life, the newspapers are saying, like, yeah, this guy would be in the National League right now. But, and so it's quite a story. So he finally catches on to the Indianapolis ABCs. He plays in the very first game, the first game that features a professional Negro League team in Richmond. And so I just kind of fell down the rabbit hole because he was the very first player in that registry at the back of the book that I kind of created. And unfortunately, he met a fairly quick end as well. And so he was in Kansas City playing for the precursor to the Kansas City Monarchs, who eventually signed, Jackie Robinson decades later and all that. Anyways, he has spinal meningitis, and he catches spinal meningitis somehow, and 3 days later he's dead. So his remains were brought back to Spiceland. And the Quakers, loved him so much. The town adored this man, and they buried him in the cemetery, and he was in an unmarked grave for 65 years until 1977, when the Spiceland Alumni Association gave him a headstone. So that's actually kind of what I'm working on now. He was also the first black player to play on Reed Field, which was Earlham College's first true baseball field. So I could talk about John Merida till the cows come home. I'll stop there. But
no.
The guy was a trailblazer, and I've been able to compile all of his statistics. And for the dead ball era of baseball, they are eye-popping. I mean, like, literally eye-popping.
Well, that's fantastic. And where can our listeners actually find both your books, and also where can they listen to your podcast?
Oh, that's kind of you, Chris. So the books are both on Amazon. You can search on Amazon. The publisher is Lulu. That's Lulu. So if you go to Lulu Publishers, the bookstore, you'll find them there. They're on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. I think that's the major ones. If you're not sure and you're like, I don't know if I want to make this investment, let me get a preview. I think they're also on Google Books, so you can read snippets there. And then for the podcast, again, Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast, is on Apple. It's on the Apple Podcast, Spotify, Podbean, Castbox, I think. Yeah.
Well, let me say this, and I was going to get, you had mentioned that that was my next question, my last question actually, was what's next for you. I think you kind of teased it a little bit, indicating that you are writing I'm assuming another book are you going to write, or you have, and also what other plans do you have? Yeah, so honestly, the thing I'm working on right now is the John Merida, whereas the Black Ball and even Folk Hero Forever are kind of more chronicles, so to speak. I want the John Merida story to be more of a narrative, truly, where you don't even have to be a baseball fan to read it. I mean, it's a human interest story, just about an extraordinary person in a very extraordinary circumstance, if I'm being honest. So I am working on the John Merida bit. I'm kicking around something about Dottie Schroeder, who was she played in all 12 seasons of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. So that's kind of also coming down the pike. She played for my Fort Wayne Daisies, so I'm a bit of a sucker for them.
So that's coming down. Continue to do the podcast, and I guess those are kind of what's coming up next.
Well, I can sense your passion and enthusiasm for what you do, and if it's okay with you, we would love to have you back when you get your next book written, the Meredith story, and anything else you have going on. You've been a fantastic guest for us today. We can't thank you enough for being here. And let me read the two books again to make sure everybody out there, all our listeners and viewers, please get these two books. Folk Hero Forever, The Eclectic, Enthralling Baseball Life of Luke Easter, and his second book, Blackball in the Hoosier Heartland, Unearthing the Negro Leagues Baseball History of Richmond, Indiana. They are well worth your time. There's Don holding up. Do that again, Don. Hold that book up one more time.
You're too kind. I appreciate that, Chris. Thank you.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. We can't thank you enough for being on our podcast. And that's going to wrap it up for us today. And like always, we need you to subscribe to our podcast, visit our website at pressroompass.com, and like our Facebook page. So until next time, I'm Chris Cornett for Don Tincher, Michael Swigert, and for Alex Painter. Thank you very much.
That wraps up video podcast number 1, an interview with sports author Alex Painter on Season Ticket presented by Press Room Pass. In case you're interested in following Alex or buying one of his books, we've included links in the show notes. Before we go, we'd like to know what you thought about this episode. Leave a comment below, send us an email, or visit our Facebook page. We look forward to reading what you have to say. We want to direct your attention to the podcast sponsor, PressRoomPass.com. Co-host Don Tincher writes short articles on topics relevant to the season and posts them on an almost daily basis. These are informative and entertaining stories that we don't have time to cover in the podcast. Don is also posting results of his Yankees replay using the Stratomatic Sports Simulation game. How are the powerhouse 1927 and 1961 teams faring against world champions from all eras? Review the current standings at PressRoomPass.com and read older posts to learn how they got there. While you're visiting the site, check out the sponsors and advertisers. We also want to thank our podcast subscribers for their ongoing support. Tell your friends about us. Share this episode and encourage them to subscribe. If you have a website, please consider adding a link to our podcast or to PressRoomPass.com. If you have a podcast, we'd be interested in talking with you about some cross-promotion activity. For more information, email us at seasonticket@pressroompass.com. Thanks for listening. A new episode will be announced soon. Until then, keep your eye on the ball.